right, as the room gets quiet, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. Warm welcome to the 8th annual meeting of the GBSN for Business and Human Rights Impact Community. I'm Dorothy Baumann-Polly. Many of you know me. I'm the director of the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights, and I've been working for over 10 years with Michael Posner, my colleague, and the director of the NYU Stern Center for Business and Human Rights, and together we've been developing this network with you. I'm really grateful for all of you to be here, also an online audience who can listen in today. So we have a very packed agenda today for the next 90 minutes, and I look forward to strategizing with you how we can accelerate the integration of human rights in business school education. Our agenda has two parts. In the first half, we're very fortunate to have with us Volker Türk, the UN High Commissioner for Business and Human Rights, and then we'll also hear two perspectives from Ken McPhail, head of school of the Manchester Alliance Business School, and Jeff Fokrod, the CEO and president of the Fair Labor Association. In the second half, we'll discuss strategies to accelerate. We have already done work on this, and we will particularly focus this year on how can we leverage new regulation, activate the private sector and students, and of course expand our network. We have people joining from Qatar, and also hear about new plans potentially in Asia. So with this, before we dive in, I'd like to thank my team at the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights, particularly Pascal, who's currently behind the scenes, but without her, we couldn't be here. Pascal, thank you. She's helping to bring us together every year. And I'd also like to thank the audiovisual team who makes sure that we can have this hybrid meeting and this room, actually. And of course, always thankful for the Rectorat at the University of Geneva and you personally, Stefan Battier, who's been so dedicated to this work. Thank you. Stefan, you will be providing opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you at the University of Geneva for this 8th annual meeting of the Global Business School Network for Business and Human Rights. This meeting is an opportunity for me to underline the importance of your work and, as we are in Geneva, to highlight the effort of the entire team of our Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights led by Professor Baumann-Polly, as well as those of the NYU Stern Center for Business and Human Rights and other business schools of your network to make human rights an integral part of business school education, not only in Geneva and in New York, but also in business schools worldwide. This topic of business and human rights shapes not only our global economy, but also the foundation of our societies. In global and interconnected world where complex supply chains cross continents, where every contact, sign, and every investment made can have an impact on thousands of lives, corporate responsibility in terms of respect of human rights is no longer an option, but a necessity, and human rights are not negotiable. Human rights are not just abstract principles written down in international charters. They are the foundation of our common humanity, universal value that transcend border, culture, and beliefs. But today, in 2024, it has to be said that also progress has been made since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. It remains very fragile. Indeed, the streets to democracy were at the heart of the Human Rights Week organized 2 weeks ago by the University of Geneva. Despite the fact that the UN Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights adopted in 2011 mark a turning point, there is still a long way to go and many obstacles to overcome. Millions of people continue to work in inhuman conditions. Communities are displaced in the name of major industrial projects, and vital natural resources are exploited at the detriment of future generations. That is why your work is fundamental to a sustainable economy that respects human rights. And what could be more logical than to address this topic in Geneva, which is considered to be the capital of human rights, notably with the headquarters of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and we are very honored today to have its director, Mr. Volker Türk, the High Commissioner for Human Rights. But this is just one of the international organizations that make up what we call here the International Geneva, a unique ecosystem with which the university has established close links to the benefit of our students and of our research groups. And Geneva is not only home to many international organizations and non-governmental organizations, it's also home to many multinationals that have a keen interest in better understanding the challenges and opportunities linked to business and human rights. In this way, numerous synergy can be exploited between the academic world and this ecosystem. As places of research, training, dialogue, and reflection, universities have a social responsibilities to be players in the development of policy to meet the major global challenges of the 21st century, which can only be developed through international and multi-sectoral cooperation. For example, the interdependence between climate change and human rights is increasingly well understood and is directly linked to several research projects of the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights. Today's business schools, therefore, have an important role to play in training the students who will make the tomorrow's world, as the economy is evolving rapidly and students are demanding that sustainability and human rights issues be integrated into the curriculum. Global interaction, political uncertainty, and growing inequality have increased public scrutiny of corporate activities. Business schools, therefore, have a duty to better prepare future leaders to meet the challenges of this modern global business environment. They must also demonstrate that the value and principle of their teaching are in line with the public expectation that business should contribute to a fair and prosperous global economy. To do this, it is necessary to go beyond courses on business ethics or corporate social responsibility and adapt a model that integrated social considerations at the heart of corporate curriculum, explore emerging challenges such as the role of artificial intelligence in discrimination, the environmental impact on the rights of vulnerable populations, or the transnational responsibility of business. Companies are not just economic drivers, they are also social actors bringing influence and change. By placing human rights at the heart of their activity, they can not only prosper, but also contribute to a more equitable, sustainable future that respects human dignity. This is why your network is so important, because it enables you to work together to make the relationship between business and human rights not a challenge, but an opportunity to build a better world. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you a fruitful meeting.
Stefan, thank you so much. It's so wonderful to have you as an ally at this institution. You know us and our work so well. It means a lot to us, and I know you have to leave early. This is not, you're fully committed, but I know you have to leave. Thank you for being here this morning. I'll now hand over to Mike to introduce the High Commissioner.
Thanks, Doro. First of all, I want to welcome everybody. I'm Mike Posner from NYU Stern, and I've been really fortunate. It's been a real privilege to work with Doro these last 11 years, actually, that I've been at NYU, and Doro's been part of our work. And then 5 years ago, she created the Geneva Center, and we've had these meetings for 8 years and are building a network here, which I think is really important. I want to introduce Volker Türk, who's the High Commissioner for Human Rights, but I want to put it in the context of what I call a governance gap. We live in a world where a majority of people live in countries where their governments are either unwilling or unable to protect their own people. That's a trend that's actually accelerating. Volker, as a UN official, the senior UN official dealing with human rights, deals with it from an international organization and a governmental perspective. But one of the consequences of that governance gap is that there is a need for the biggest companies, global companies in the world, to fill a void. And so the purpose of this network, as we're building it, is to recognize that the old-fashioned way of teaching business school education, assuming that there's a well-functioning, democratic, rule of law, rights-respecting state, is no longer applicable in the 21st century. Volker is somebody who comes to this role. He's been the High Commissioner for Human Rights since 2022, but he comes to it with a long history. He wrote his dissertation as a law student on the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. He went to work there after working for the Austrian government, and he became the head of protection at UNHCR. In my judgment, the most important role in that organization and the most difficult. He then went to the UN in New York, worked with the Secretary General, was an Undersecretary General for Policy, and as I say, in 2022, assumed the leadership of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We could not have a better speaker here, guest, to help us open this session than to have Volker, and we're delighted to have you.
Well, thank you very much, Dorothy, Mike, Monsieur le Vice-Recteur. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be part of this network of business schools and human rights, which, as Mike has just mentioned, is absolutely critical at this very difficult time of where we are in the world, but also at this difficult time when it comes to human rights. And I have prepared remarks, but I will steer away a bit from them to share with you a couple of thoughts that go beyond what you probably already know. I think if we look at the world of human rights today, there are two major things that come to mind, and they are directly relevant to you as heads of business schools. The one is that we see, especially in conflict and violence, I wouldn't even call it anymore slow erosion, but an erosion of standards and norms that have been established since the end of the Second World War. And as you know, the human rights regime, the legal regime, came out of cataclysmic events that the world faced, obviously at the time, with massive displacement. In Europe alone, you had 60 million people who had been displaced, with a world in disarray, in turbulence. But out of it, out of the ashes of this horrible period, came the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, over 75 years ago adopted, but came also a legal framework that meant to inform governance, not government, governance, in all respects of human activity, be it, of course, governments, parliaments, because they had to adopt it, but also, importantly, civil society and the private sector, and in particular business. And I think that in and of itself shows how important this legal framework is that we have. But then the worry that the normative framework is being eroded as we speak is a particularly pertinent one, and it directly goes to the type of work that you are doing at business schools, and how to make sure that human rights are actually taught there, because it's a legally binding framework, not just for states, but also for private actors, including business. And I think it's important to really bring this out. So the erosion I see very much play out in the context of conflict and war. What we see increasingly is an acceptance of civilian casualties, and not just in the obvious ones that everyone talks about, Ukraine and what's happening in the Middle East, but also in Sudan, in Myanmar, in Syria, still in all these 59 countries that are currently affected by conflict. So it pushes the edges of what is acceptable civilian damage, or collateral civilian damage, but also what is in terms of civilian infrastructure. You probably saw what's happening in Ukraine with the massive destroyment of energy infrastructures that are absolutely critical for the survival of people, especially during winter. The second point, general point that I'm worried about, is that there is a more reductionist view of human rights these days. The reductionist view of human rights doesn't talk about what people are worried about, their grievances, right to adequate housing, a single mom with 3 kids having to do 3 jobs in order to be able to put them through education, a situation of those who suffer during warfare. The actual nuts and bolts of what our life is, which is our housing, education, healthcare, which is essentially the basic necessities of life, that's no longer seen as human rights in some quarters. What is seen is sometimes, especially in this discussion around wokeism, that human rights is equalized with wokeism, which of course is very important because you need inclusion and you need participation, but it doesn't actually present the full range of human rights that are available and obligations for countries and need to be worked through. In the context of business sectors, of course, you will see your future, those who go through business school, they will lead companies. They will have to face the big dilemmas of our time, whether or not to, especially with the green transition, whether or not to work in areas or in countries that are affected by conflict and war, or where human rights violations occur. And yet we know how important, especially some of the precious resources are in these countries. So they will be faced with massive dilemmas that we need to help them work through. And as a result, you have this whole business and human rights movement that has helped companies in the past and responsible actors to work through these dilemmas, to work through these tensions, to explain that there are guardrails in the way that also business activities are done, also in the interest of sustainability of business, in the interest of the future of any private activity that goes beyond the immediate short-term gain that you can face. Then the other area that I think is particularly important apart from these dilemmas is that, especially when it comes to innovation and creativity, and particularly for the big technology companies, that they realize whoever develops new things, well, it plays out in particular in generative AI, that they know that if they put these things on the market, that they need to be tested against human rights in particular. What does it mean in terms of the taxonomy of risks that are informed by human rights? We have done a project with the big companies on a taxonomy of risks from a human rights perspective, especially for artificial generative AI. And that's a very important area of work, because if they are not looked at it from that perspective, we may end up almost going back to times where those who would put products on the market before regulation would actually benefit enormously from it, but at the same time destroy not only the lives of the livelihoods of people, but also the interaction that people have among themselves. And we have seen it in particular when it comes to social media platforms, and how social media platforms, if there are no guardrails attached, are actually leading not only to the destruction of social cohesion, but also the loss of public space in today's world. So I just wanted to come back again to the importance of your work as the educators for the future business leaders of tomorrow, that they are fully aware not only of the normative framework that human rights law offers, what it means for them concretely, but also what it means in terms, not just because it's ethical, but it's also legal to do it, and that they see it in their enlightened self-interest, for business to be sustainable, for business to be responsible, for business not to be at some stage subjected to litigation and lawsuits, that they actually see it in their interest to embrace this important framework, which is a framework of the future, which is a framework of long-term thinking, which is a framework of sustainability, but also of a mission. We launched last year the concept of a human rights economy. And in that concept, we wanted to make sure that macroeconomics as well are influenced by human rights considerations, because what we have often discovered is that those who develop economic models, the economists, the macroeconomists in particular, that they don't really know very much about human rights. I asked Professor Mariana Mazzucato, who wrote this fantastic book about the mission economy. I said to her, did you learn about human rights when you studied economics? And she said, not really. And in fact, she developed her mission economy around essentially concepts of human rights. And she now, of course, is a great fan of the type of work that we are doing on the human rights economy, which has the business sector, the private sector angle. It has, of course, also the macroeconomic angle, because frankly, when it comes to the international financial institutions and the incredible debt that lower income countries and even middle income countries face these days, not least in the wake of COVID, where we have seen huge inequities on the special drawing rights, for example, that were actually benefiting more higher income countries than anyone else because of the liquidity crisis that countries faced during and after COVID. You actually see huge gaps of equities and inequalities that play out between countries, but of course then play out internally within countries and affect mostly the vulnerable and the poor. So the human rights dimension, when it comes to debt, when it comes to austerity measures, when it comes to fundamental macroeconomic policy making, has become extremely important. And we really want to make sure that the human rights due diligence comes in, that human rights assessments are made when these decisions are taken. And again, it's playing out also then at the company level or at the business level. And I think you are playing an incredibly important role, stepping up to a responsibility that is a shared one, it's a collective one, and encompasses not only what government does, because government often is quite short-term, they think of electoral cycles only, and these electoral cycles become more and more confusing as we see the results of it. But you are actually into the long term, because any good business today will want to embrace a human rights angle and will want to embrace sustainability from a human rights perspective. And human rights actually help you work through the tensions and the dilemmas that are faced in daily life. And as a result, it's, from our perspective, extremely key that students of economics and business schools are fully aware of that framework. So I've not actually delivered any of what I have in my statement, which we will share with you. But I did think, because I thought it was a different setting, so it's good that I share with you very, not spontaneous, they have obviously been thought through along many times, but some remarks that I hope will be important in your considerations and as you go forward. So again, thanks very much for the invitation.
Great, really good.
Thank you for your very relevant remarks and for helping us to frame this meeting. I know you also have to take off, but thanks for being with us. Your support means a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Quick transition here in the room to an online participant. Ken, are you with us? Yes, I can see you on the screen. Good morning, Ken. Can you?
Hi, Donald.
Perfect. Okay. Ken, please, you've been with us at the very beginning as we started this work, and we're so happy to have you back. Now you're head of school, so your perspective has changed. You're now leading a business school. We're very keen to hear from you how you see the role of human rights in business school education in your new role and for many other business schools around the world. Over to you.
Thanks, Doro. It is a privilege to join you from Hong Kong, visiting one of our centres here. Look, much of what I was going to say, Volker has already said, and that to some extent is reassuring, and I think does convey this sense of convergence that something really quite fundamental needs to happen in the way that we change our thinking about business and what we teach our students. But just a few words. I was reminiscing with Doro that it's almost exactly a decade since I wrote a small piece in the Financial Times that was, of course, inspired by the guiding principles on business and human rights. And in that piece, we called on business schools to rethink their relevance and assess business impact on society. And it sparked a friendship with Doro and Mike and the broader business and human rights community, which for me has really been quite transformational in my thinking about business. I think at the time we were all excited because we saw in the business and human rights debates a way to draw on established values and legal frameworks to help, I guess, bring some depth of understanding and rigor to how we were thinking about what the S meant in corporate social responsibility or ESG in that relationship between business and society. I think it's been a real privilege to have been part of those early discussions, and I do think that history will show that the guiding principles were quite a fundamental breakthrough moment. But I think, as we've heard already today, while I think we have made significant progress in applying the GPs to business practice, I think growing political polarization and geopolitical disruption is actually a consequence. It's an outcome of the fact that we've not really made enough progress, and we've really, I think, despite the progress that we've made, failed to rethink the relationship between business and society quickly enough. Again, as we've heard already, I think that growing inequality, the reconfiguration of global supply chains, the ethical challenges of AI, all mean that the requirement for business schools to help address economic and social challenges is really more pressing than ever. So I do think it's been a privilege to be part of the GBSN Business and Human Rights Network and to observe its growth over the past years. I think it does have a hugely important role to play in pushing the agenda forward. I think as part of that push, we need to engage more businesses. We need to engage the private sector more, and we do need to engage more deans. Of course, that comes at a difficult time, particularly in the UK. Many business schools are facing quite significant financial challenges, and I'm sure you'll hear of similar challenges in the States. Again, as Volker was saying, I think given the political environment, the tendency might be to kind of label business and human rights as something that's too woke or too regulatory. That's entirely wrong, as Volker has said. I think the question of how we get the economy progressing, how we get economic progress to also deliver social progress is one of the biggest economic and democratic challenges that we face. So I think the University of Manchester has been quite brave in appointing someone who fundamentally believes in that need to reimagine business and its role in society as a business school dean, and that's a huge privilege to be then tasked with that challenge of reimagining education and its content, reimagining engagement with business and how we partner, reimagining collaborations with technology companies, precisely on the point that Volker was mentioning around about how we grapple with the ethical challenges of AI and technology. So, look, it's been a huge privilege to be part of the community so far. I think now is a critical time for that community to step up, to engage, and to really make the business, economic, and social case for why business and human rights needs to be at the core of how we reimagine business as a force for good. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing more about how the discussions unfold today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. I'm glad you can stay with us. Let's clap. Yeah. Because in the second half of the meeting, we will be discussing a couple of things that you just highlighted would be incredibly helpful. We have to sign up more businesses, you said, and we have to sign up more deans. Of course, we count on you for that latter part. But thank you so much for your remarks, and thanks for staying on. In the second part, we will have a bit of time for that discussion, and if you're online, you can also put your thoughts in the chat. I don't think we'll get to engage with your comments online during the meeting, but we will get back to you afterwards. So next, I'm looking forward to hear from the perspective of a multi-stakeholder initiative, the Fair Labor Association, which is a special multi-stakeholder initiative in that it has universities as one of its constituencies. So I'm very happy to have you here, Jeff. Please tell us how you see the role for human rights in business school education. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Doro. I'm very happy to be here. As a former business school student, I recall how much I took away from that experience. And as Doro said, students and universities have played a very important role in the Fair Labor Association since our founding. The student movement in the 1990s, when students said that university sweatshirts, jerseys were being made in unacceptable conditions, was one of the drivers behind President Clinton bringing together the major businesses, universities. One of the major drivers behind President Clinton bringing together the major businesses, universities, and civil society organizations to form what became the Fair Labor Association, and we've grown from there. Universities still play a very important role in our governance. As Doro said, we have a tripartite governance structure where businesses, universities, and civil societies all have equal representation in our governance, which is a very important part, I think, of keeping us going in the right direction. We also benefit from the academic work of universities, and I'm very happy to say a couple of months ago we signed a memorandum of understanding with the University of Geneva to explore joint projects to advance human rights in supply chains. And so I want to thank you all for the role you have in driving the whole field forward in your academic work. I also want to emphasize, and this is maybe the primary point I want to emphasize, we work with some of the largest companies in the world based in 22 countries, and I can tell you that companies really need and want people on their teams who have human rights skills and insights. And that is especially true with the with the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive going into effect. I know we are all thinking about how to effectively support successful transition and implementation of mandatory due diligence, and having the right people on companies' own teams is certainly a part of that. So I want to thank you for your role in educating the students who will be doing that. Maybe the last thing I'll say is this is our 25th anniversary year, and so we are reflecting on everything that the Fair Labor Association has built over 25 years. And I see around the table some who were involved in getting it started, Mike, Justine, and I think I see on the screen Sharon Waxman, my predecessor, who has played such an important role in building the Fair Labor Association. And we're also looking forward to the next 25 years and where we want to be 25 years from now. And part of that is thinking about who is going to be leading this work in 25 years. And it's the people that you are mentoring and educating. And so I certainly want to thank you for that. I appreciate the chance to be here, and looking forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you, Jeff, for being here. And again, many of the points that you just made, we will come back to it and hope to work with the FLA on research potentially, but also on engaging with the private sector potentially. Let's now move to the second part of today's meeting. And before we get into it, I have to highlight that we have with us Dan Leclerc, who's been instrumental in building this network with us over the past years. GBSN impact community, it's in our name now, and without Dan's and Julie, again, someone behind the scenes who's not in Geneva today, but without their support, we would have not been able to grow as we did over the past years. And Dan has been a wonderful connector to, well, some of you in the room. Thanks to Dan, we met. And one strategy for moving forward clearly is to grow the network. And again, I see GBSN as a key partner for that. On this slide, we did one slide to just provide an overview of the many strategies we have already been working on to advance human rights in business school education. One I just mentioned, clearly we want to grow the network, and later today we'll hear from someone from Qatar and also others how we could do this. We have focused on a few things last year. So this year we are focusing on new strategies. Last year we had a whole cluster of discussions around how can we work together to develop teaching resources. And Maria Galati and others from the ILO are in the room, and we've been working together over the past 2 years to develop such teaching resources on decent work in the fishing industry, but also this year we just published a new resource package on labor migration and fair recruitment. So this is ongoing work. But today we want to focus on 3 strategies that I hope to really advance in the next year, namely how can we activate the private sector, how can we activate students, and how can we expand the network, again, ongoing work. But we start off with, of course, what some call the new era in our field of business human rights, with new legislation that has been adopted this summer, CSDDD in the EU, and we have Björn Fasseling with us, a long-term participant of our network, who's become a dedicated expert of the intricate mechanics of these legislations, but he will talk not about these today, but about how can we leverage the fact that there is now a hard law for bringing human rights to business school education. Björn, over to you.
Thanks, Doro. Can you all hear me? Yeah, fine. So I'm to leverage the legislation, I would like to highlight 3 laws that were adopted by the European Union this year. The first one, you have already heard it, is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, 3Ds. So that will, once implemented into national legislation, lead to every European member state having due diligence laws. So, and also those that already have some, like France and Germany, will have to adapt their laws. And this legislation will directly apply to about 6,000 companies in the European Union, and also extraterritorially to about 900 or 1,000 companies outside of the European Union that want to do business. And But in reality, many more companies will be involved because all of these companies do business with partners and try to, if they have to do mandatory due diligence, they have to also probably tell their partners to participate in these due diligence schemes, which will lead to, in fact, hundreds of thousands of companies being involved in due diligence. So the second piece of legislation is one that was just adopted last week, on Tuesday, is the forced labor regulation, which is a complementary one. And I think that this one takes a different angle. It gives authorities, the European Commission, also national authorities, will give authorities the power to ban products that have forced labor somewhere inside it throughout the supply chain. So just imagine a car manufacturer that discovers that there's one piece in the car that has forced labor inside it, and then they have to take it back from the market. And that is pretty scary for companies because that costs a lot of money that they have to then do this. So I think that this kind of regulation might even be more effective than the Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And then the last piece of legislation is the AI Act, that while not explicitly mentioning due diligence, has, at least for high-risk systems, and in fact, many systems, AI systems would be qualified as high-risk systems, have quite extensive risk management obligations. And you all know that due diligence is a special form of risk management. So I view the AI Act as a special type of due diligence legislation. And so how can we leverage that? So businesses typically complain about due diligence, mandatory due diligence. They say it's bureaucratic, it's going to lead to costs for the business, and it's not going to really help people on the ground. And even companies that make a good effort, good faith effort, they say we're kind of discouraged because we have been trying to do good due diligence, and now we have this level playing field, and everybody is faking it, and we're now discouraged to do the good effort. So. In a way, these arguments are a bit disingenuous, aren't they? Because, indeed, I agree that if companies don't want to do due diligence, don't want to respect human rights, then these laws might be very ineffective, might be, in fact, bureaucratic. And that's where we come in, isn't it? So we have to actually try to instill this genuine wish or strategy, implement strategies that companies really want to respect human rights or fundamental rights, as we say it. And that's decisive for the effectiveness of the law. It's a bit circular. If companies don't want to do it, the law will not be effective. If they're genuinely convinced that it is important to respect human rights, then the law can be effective because it only has to take care of those companies that don't care. So that's, I think that's where we come in. That's our responsibility. And I think also, and that's the other advantage of laws, is that it is always a good argument to say, well, if this is what companies are supposed to do anyways, then why? And if this is supposed to become routine management, because that's the standard, look into the law, I think that's a very good argument to convince deans, academic directors of master programs to put due diligence into the syllabus. I think they have no excuse anymore not to, in fact, at least and not only in the European Union, as I said, also any company that wants to do business in the European Union will be concerned by mandatory due diligence or the AI Act's provisions. So I think that this can be a very helpful argument to leverage. I'll stop there, but I would look forward to discuss. I see the time is very, very tight. So.
Yeah, definitely an important reference point for all conversations with people who are not in the business human rights field to say it's no longer optional, there is actually hard law. Let's use that. We also discussed many times before how can we activate the private sector to speak up for our cause, and it was actually thanks to Matthew Kilgariff last year, who's a former executive of the Richemont Group, who said, I want to help you. I want to work with you. I want to figure out how can I speak up for bringing human rights to business school education. I think this is important. And then he went on a bike tour. So, Matthew, why don't you just say a couple of words about how you've been supporting our cause over the past year. And thanks to you, we created what we now call an ambassador program. Ambassadors that were in the private sector for a long time have that experience and the networks and think they should use every occasion they get to also speak about business school education. So you.
Doro, thank you, and good morning, everybody. So I'm sorry not to be with you in person. I'm just going to speak briefly about private sector, the bicycle ride, of course, and what that means for business schools around Europe. So private sector, first of all, I spent 25 years with a Swiss company called Richemont. It's the holding of many luxury good names. So think of Cartier watches and jewelry and all the gold and diamonds in there, or Montblanc pens, and 20 other brands of that type. So during my time there, putting human rights on the agenda was, I'll be honest, difficult. That was before all the legislation came along, and even well before John Ruggie's work was completed. It was difficult. So the S that was referred to earlier, sometimes it was understood as social in a rather sacred way, long-term virtue and halos, and I was one of the people that helped to establish a standard for the watch and jewelry supply chains, a certification standard. That was in 2005. And then private sector, it behaves differently. Clearly it's not academia and it's not government. It is largely self-serving, so that's another S. Move away from the long-term sacred feeling and more to the rather short-term self-serving. So a lot of that certification work in the supply chain was risk mitigation. No other way around it. Getting people to worry about things was hard. Getting people to do things was also hard once you got them worrying about it. So that's a little bit about the background of private sector. Maybe I'm out of date. Things have changed. We do now have these regulatory regime to address. That's meant that a lot of the business and human rights topic has moved to legal teams inside companies of Richemont's size. By the way, Richemont's size, 20 billion euro of sales each year. So it's a large cap public company. Promised you something on the bicycle ride. I know Doro is also a cyclist, so she's particularly keen to hear about my bicycle ride. I took a sabbatical this year and took a bicycle ride around Central and Eastern Europe. Solo effort, just sort of noodling around on a bicycle, stretching my legs and opening my eyes to see countries that were previously closed. Well, I can assure you now they're very open. 9,000 kilometers on a bicycle through the warmer months. The warmer months are behind us now. On the way, I visited as many business schools as I could as the experimental European ambassador for GBSN. Some examples in Switzerland, the University of Freiburg, in Poland, the SGH, which is the leading business school in that country, and Poland, in particular Warsaw, has become something of the hub, the capital, in the way that New York is the economic capital of the United States. Well, Warsaw is becoming the economic capital of Central and Eastern Europe. So I spent time with the Dean's team there, saying what was available, telling them about GBSN. Ditto in Croatia, and again in Romania. And I see we have Monica from the ASE on the call. So I would just sit and really just drink tea with the Dean. That was the idea. As I went around on my bicycle ride, telling them that the GBSN existed, teaching resources are available, and where are they? What's the state of their appetite as a business school for joining the club, using the tools, that sort of thing. And if there was interest, as an ambassador, of course, I would simply refer them to Doro. Wouldn't profess to be an expert in the matter, but refer them back to Doro, introduce them to the GBSN. To conclude, what was the appetite that I found on that bicycle ride? Very, very mixed. General strong interest, but very little integration of either the sustainability agenda or even the business and human rights agenda in the core program of MBA schemes. And the professors and the deans were very honest about that. It felt like early days. Our agenda is crowded. Once we've dealt with accounting and marketing and these things, where do you put business and human rights? And I always have a flashback to my running joke. Integrating business and human rights at Richemont. First of all, the marketing people said, oh, it's got the word business, we'll have it. And then they took a closer look and they said, no, thank you. Then the human resources department saw they had the word humans. They said, well, we'll have it. And then they took a closer look and said, no, actually, no, thank you. And then the lawyers saw the word rights, that's us, we'll have a look. And they took a closer look and they said, no, thank you. And then business and human rights ended up back with me as general secretary and the sustainability director of the group. So what goes around comes around. It's now with the lawyers at Richmond because of the regulatory mandatory scheme. And I'm hoping that the deans that I've seen on my bicycle ride are in touch with Doro and taking next steps with them. Doro, back to you.
Thank you, Matthew, for sharing. And when they reach out, I'm very grateful that I had a couple of colleagues last year, including Lucy, who I cannot see right now, but she's in the room, to put together a frequently asked questions document about our work, about the resources that exist. And this is what I then send out and hope that they come back to me a second time, because I do see an analogy between the integration of human rights in big businesses that you experienced, Matthew, and the integration of human rights in business schools. Maybe we're a bit ahead of the curve, but let's make sure that the world catches up. All right, thank you, Matthew. I'm very thrilled to also have Ron Popper with us, CEO Global Business Initiative on Human Rights. Ron, sorry, your view is currently blocked. I can't look you in the eye, but you've been working with you've been part of a large multinational corporation yourself, ABB. At the time I interviewed, I was a PhD student. You were working on the integration of human rights in a business. Now you run the Global Business Initiative with many companies that are working or struggling on that integration. But I'm also very happy you agreed to be here and hopefully become a second ambassador to our network, since you're in touch with so many other companies.
Thank you, Doro. I think we struggle to sort of match Matthew's cycling prowess, but I've got 2 or 3 key messages really. I've also been working a lot with business schools teaching, and I see these brilliant minds coming through, being educated on, particularly on the S, which actually I believe is human rights, and the human rights element is also part of the E, and it's also part of the G. But they really are coming through now, and we need to make increased efforts for a number of reasons. But I think where we have a problem is actually in terms of communication, in terms of messaging. I watch companies, and they are panicking now with CSDDD. They've been caught out. They have had 14 years to start integrating the UNGPs, and many of them are still on the starting blocks, to be honest. I think what we need to do, and I said this at the United Nations Forum 10 years ago, is to create a pull from business to business schools. Not just always a push by business schools, but a pull. And I think to do that, we need some sound communications along the lines of the High Commissioner's unscripted remarks. We need to show managements that there is a moral imperative, that there is an economic value, that there's a cost-saving value, that human rights due diligence is an investment, and so forth, in order to create that pull. I also think we're, in part, aiming at the wrong people. Yes, it's perfectly correct to target senior management and board members as part of the push, but they're the ones that control the purse strings. They're the ones that will create the culture of a company. But I think, particularly now, in this new proto-legal era, we need to be targeting a number of other people in companies. Heads of procurement, heads of human resources, heads of legal, of course, and so forth. We're missing a trick there, because they are crying out for people who have at least a basic understanding of the business and human rights ESG agenda. What else? Yeah, I think we need to hone our messaging. We need to be talking about resilient business, creating stronger and more resilient business, going beyond legal compliance, which is a temptation in many of the multinationals I know, sticking to compliance. We need to be plugging the issue of climate and human rights as well. Obviously, there's a very, very strong link there, and companies are only just starting to zero in on that, and they're still not really getting the need for climate and environmental people and human rights people to be working more closely. So I think there are a number of areas in which, as we work and as we seek to attract investment from business, and as we seek to ensure that we have the best possible graduates from business schools to go into the business world, we need just to hone that, the elevator pitch. We need to hone the communications down to very basic, simple ideas which senior management can get. They don't need UNGP speak. They don't need CSDDD thrown at them, although it is a big motivator for sure. They just need to get it in terms of moral and for moral and economic reasons. And I think that's something that we could work on a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. I hope you would help us in defining those very simple messages that business schools can then jointly, put to senior executives, but also heads of procurement, legal, and human resources. I think that's important to reach all levels. Thank you, Ron. Let's move on to activating students. So we talked about the private sector, and now how can we activate students? It was a suggestion made actually by Charles initially, but we also heard from Jeff how instrumental students were in creating the FLA. Our classrooms, the ones that we teach, Mike, they're full. There are more and more students who want to be taught on human rights. They want to be part of the solution. And I know you're running an organization, Catherine, called Positive Impact Rating, where you bring that student voice to the fore. So tell us more about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doro. It's a great pleasure to be here. Indeed, students are often ahead of faculty in business schools. When I was a dean at the business school, I realized that students were my ally. By bringing the student voice into the conversation, I realized that we could have a different conversation about changing the curriculum research focus at a business school. So the positive impact rating is one of many levers of change, and I look forward to seeing how we can help the human rights movement accelerate the change at business schools. So far in the past year, we've measured a bit more than 100 schools. The positive impact rating is trying to celebrate success of business schools rather than shaming. So I think I believe that is really important from the perspective of many deans in conversations still admit that they're afraid of the student voice. That's an issue. So deans tell me, no, we'd rather not be rating our school through students because we're afraid of what they have to say. So this is a little bit similar to what is happening in business, I feel, today. There's a certain backlash on human rights, on sustainability, and so forth, where they say, I feel in many ways we are back 15 years where we have in business to make the business case for sustainability and human rights. In business schools, it's a bit the same thing. We have to make the business school case as to why it makes sense to integrate all of this. So let's do it. Let's not pretend that the mindset shift has taken place, but let's talk to the people with where they are and engage with them where they are and kind of bring them forward. So that's a little bit where we are and what we're trying to do. Part of who is behind the business school. Oh, and actually what I wanted to say, there's so many of the business schools are in the room. I saw Monash, BI, Sasson, EdTech, HEC Paris that are here. So actually some of there are already a number of schools here. I also wanted to say, Dan, thanks from GBSN for supporting the positive impact rating or helping it co-initiate it. Together we are stronger. And so I'm super happy to be here for that. How could we use the peer to activate the student voice on human rights? One thing that the positive impact rating is trying to do is to make sure that once the results are there, is to initiate a dialogue between the students and the dean's office. So I think that could be one way to activate, to accelerate that voice, is to have students meet with the dean's office. And the peer is a method to make that happen. That could help. How could that happen? I was kind of trying to think ahead of time about this. Paul Polman always said, let's measure what we treasure. Each school at the positive impact rating has up to 4 open-ended questions that they can draw up questions any which way that they want to get that feedback to the dean's office. So that's a way that exists already today, kind of designed questions. So maybe a group of, maybe we could draft up suggested questions for business schools, saying like, why don't you measure this also? So that may be one concrete way of collaborating. And then last but not least, we do have an open-ended question at the positive impact rating where we ask students, what would you like your business school to stop doing? And what would you like your business school to start doing? And then we accumulate them across the 15,000 student voices, and this is kind of what globally comes across. Human rights is not on there, but certainly one of the things that they want to say stop doing is stop greenwashing and engage in unethical partnerships with business. So students are pretty much call out business schools there. My recommendation would be, in order to engage more business school deans, is to translate the stick to the carrot. We've noticed that the finger pointing is really an issue, but if we can translate the opportunity that activating the student voice could mean to a dean and a business school, that could be a way to engage with them. The positive impact rating celebrates the schools that do well, so we have a 5-star, like a Michelin guide kind of a rating. We don't rank, so that protects schools a little bit that have maybe not super consistent rating every year, and we don't show the bottom 2 stars. So schools that don't perform well, we often tell the deans, don't worry, you won't be featured, we don't shame your performance, but we provide you with the starting block. So a little bit of insights from my side. Look forward to collaborating.
Thank you. I think it's a fantastic initiative to bring to the fore the power of students that really want this. And I've seen what students apparently want is integrate stakeholders from business and society into the learning process. I think they don't mention business and human rights, but I see many elements of things that are part of business human rights research and teaching. So thank you for that presentation. There are many other ways, sure, to also bring students, to integrate student voices and use students to make the case to deans and other decision makers. Let's hopefully talk about this after the next input, the final input, namely how can we expand our network. This is foundational to us going forward, and last year we created, we heard of a model that was created at Qatar Business School with the help of the ILO and Mike and Lucy actually being in Qatar, where a casebook was created, locally relevant teaching cases for business human rights. And Qatar University is also the leader of a network in the region of, I believe, 14 other business schools. So this is where they can then distribute those cases to. Hani, are you with us? Can you hear us?
Hello, Dorothy. Nice meeting you today,
Wonderful.
this morning.
Please provide an update on what you've been doing since last year.
Okay, good morning, everyone. It's I'm so sorry for not being able to be present with you last year. but I'm joining with you today from Doha, Qatar. Actually, for those who are not aware of our new alliance, it's alliance for 15 business colleges within the MENA region. And since our meeting last year, we have made many significant achievements in our collaboration with the GBSN Business Human Rights, as well as ILO, as Dorothy said. So I will, the most significant achievement that we have made is, as you said, Dorothy, it's to create or to develop a case book on the human rights using local companies in Doha, Qatar. So I think my colleague, Professor Saeed Al-Banna, I will give him the floor to discuss in detail or briefly about the main topics that have been addressed in this case book. So I will leave the floor now to Professor Saeed.
Hi, Dorothy and everyone. I'm very glad to have this opportunity. I think you hear me, yeah? Okay, that's great. So let me give some reflections on this case book. It started about 3 years ago. ILO, Marie from ILO, and Hani from our college, who is responsible for Sustainability Alliance, they visited my office, and we agreed to develop this case book. It's more than case book. So one of the reflection about that, we agreed on to develop a case book based on case studies on human rights and responsible management in local companies here in Qatar. The methodology we approached, ILO, they have a long experience working with local organization and international organization in Qatar, different types of organization. So we selected a set of 8 organizations, belong to different sectors: public organizations, semi-governmental organizations, and private organizations. And for each case, we addressed the experience of these companies in developing their human rights practices, addressing the challenges they have been facing, the achievements they have been done, and their way forward. The objective of the case book, we have another one, which is training our instructors and faculty members on writing case studies on human rights, because this is for us a new practice. We used to write cases on different business practices, but not about human rights. So this is one of the outcomes of this project, in addition to enhancing their awareness of the topic, business ethics, human rights, and so on. The good news, we have already finished writing the 8 case studies. We are now in the stage of writing an introduction and conclusion chapter of this case book. I think the next stage, this is not the whole story, the next stage, it should be working on how can we integrate these case studies into our curricula to be used in the classroom. So in that case, we're spreading the word of human rights and business, responsible business and responsible management in our classroom among our students. Not only this, I think there's another milestone of that project. It might be going beyond Qatar and replicating the same project in other GCC countries. This is briefly an outline of the project, and I'm glad if you have any questions or queries.
Thank you, Saeed.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for that update.
Thank you. Okay, I'm back again.
Okay, welcome back.
So sorry. Okay, just an update about other initiatives that we have adopted within the Alliance. during our CSR summit last April, actually we managed in collaboration with you and ILO to come to develop an educational material on the labor rights in the sustainable supply chain management, and this educational material will be publicly available for everyone in the globe. Actually, it will be uploaded very soon on the digital platform of our alliance. Again, within this material, again, we tackled the topics like the responsible or the ethical procurement procedures, the remedies and the grievance mechanism. And actually also there was a session led by Professor John Bergeson from St. Andrew, and I'm very grateful to him. It's about the integration of the human rights in the accounting disciplines. Again, this session it's now being edited, and I will share it with you, with the GBSN group very soon, and with my colleagues, so it can be uploaded, and many faculty members and students can be able to access all these materials and these videos. To conclude, what we are trying to make in the next year, again, we are trying now to write an educational material on the business, on the responsible business conduct, taking into consideration how we are going to measure the risk of violating the human rights, how to report it. We are quite aware of the new legislation enacted by the EU Parliament, which is called the CSRD, as mentioned by one of the previous speakers. So again, this CSRD, or the Corporate Social Responsibility Directive, or Corporate Social Responsibility Due Diligence Directive, again, it will have an impact on the trade between the EU companies and the local companies here. So in order to avoid any interruption in the trade between the local companies and the EU companies, we need to come up or to develop these materials in order to help the instructors, the students, and the practitioner as well be familiar with what rules or what procedure should be adopted. And thank you everyone for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you for this update. I really think you're the point person, together with Saeed, for the entire region now. And I hope we replicate this model from Qatar in other regions of the world now, with one key institution that entertains an entire network in the region. Thank you so much to both of you, Hani and Saeed.
Thank you.
Very brief update from another region. Charles has been to Bangkok twice now, I believe, and also has ideas how to advance the work in other parts of the world. So please, Charles, tell us how we could replicate the Qatar model.
Thank you, Doro. Yeah, I think we're all very inspired by what Hani and Saeed were saying. I'm very impressed by how fast and quickly they're going, and it brings me to reflect a little bit about what makes a regional dynamic and why it's successful, particularly in the MENA region. I think there's linguistic coherence, most probably, which is interesting, and also the fact that a lot of the teaching happening in MENA business schools is maybe done in Arabic, and so there's on one hand maybe a lack of local contextualized resources, and a local regional coherence which helps foster the network, which is quite challenging in other regions. So we've been, for the past couple of years, trying to use the UN Regional Forum in Bangkok, which is the Asia-Pacific Forum, to basically have a conversation around teaching business and human rights. This year there was a couple of sessions. Justine, on my left, participated in a session, and I led another one, which basically shows that there's a lot of interest. There's also a lot of things happening at the individual level that we don't necessarily know about. We had David Bishop from Hong Kong University talk to us about how they've been populating a local case study repository, the Asia repository of case studies, with business and human rights case studies that maybe a lot of people outside of Asia are not familiar with. So sometimes it's not just about convincing people about what we're doing, but just connecting with the right people. In the spirit of the teaching resources that the GBSN network has developed with the University of Geneva and the ILO. This year we organized a training for teachers who were interested. So we had participants from Thailand, Vasu, which was on the screen earlier, from Sassin Business School, very generously hosted us in Sassin Business School. And we had participants from Thailand, from Malaysia, from Indonesia. In Indonesia, there's a very interesting dynamic happening right now, which is also coming out of, I would say, GBSN for BHR work. After a workshop to design a teaching resource, one of the professors from Universitas Diponegoro in Central Java, he took it back to Central Java. We developed together a resource on fishing. And he's been going around the country. I'm not sure it's on a bicycle, but could be. Working with local business schools of Central Java. So they've already trained professors in 5 different coastal universities. And obviously that's a big issue. It's easy to say we want to expand the network. It's much more difficult to say how do we build locally relevant content. There was very little teaching resources on decent work in commercial fishing. And obviously in coastal universities in Indonesia, that's one of the most pressing issues. So GBSN is answering the need by providing the resources, the teaching resources, but also going really directly to see the professors in the school. Lastly, I want to say a word about Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. I'm a bit concerned that there's not as much traction happening there. I want to go back to the language issue. You know, there's a UN Forum on Business and Human Rights. There was the 3rd edition this year in Kenya. In my opinion, it's really dominated by English conversations. And so when you look, I mean, I only see the agenda and the participants and the speakers, and it's amazing to see how diverse it is to some extent. But really, you can see who's not participating, and I could not identify one speaker from West Africa, French-speaking West Africa, for example. And so I'm a bit concerned that there are some regions where the traction is not happening as much. We have, with some other French-speaking business and human rights motivated people, a conversation right now amongst us. Because it's not just about translating the concepts, but we don't have a French word for remedy. We don't really have a French word for human rights due diligence. There's a lot of confusion between duty of vigilance and due diligence, and so we tend to misunderstand some of the concepts or think that we're doing it correctly. So maybe next year this is a region where we'll dedicate some more efforts to try to bring people into action.
Yeah. Thanks, Charles, for the great work you've been doing with partners in Asia, but also thinking through how could we integrate other language regions into our work. We do have multiple language speakers in this group, so we should think that through. And you're right, we need the right people and the right resources to make this happen. So at this point, I'd like to open up to you. We've received lots of input from great speakers, but I want to hear from others as well. How do you see advancing the work in the future? Just for you to know, we will close the online meeting in about 10 minutes, as promised. But the room will still be available. I know many of you will go to the UN Forum. Some of you may want to stay to debrief with us, to discuss where do we go from here. You also know we shared a handout prior to the meeting with key resources, for example, the legislation that Björn referred to. The links are on that handout. And if there's more that you would like to share in the future, please reach out to us and Julianne, because we have a newsletter and we can share regularly events, publications, whatever you think is relevant for this group. But now over to you. Karin?
Is it turned on? Can you hear me on the screen? Okay. So thank you very much, and thank you for once again organizing this fantastic opportunity to meet with more and more people around this our common interest. So a couple of points I would like to share following this very interesting interventions by different speakers and experts is, first of all, I think to starting from the end, so backwards, the point that Charlotte raised, this is something that I think we need to pay a lot of attention to the fact that much of the business and human rights conversation is in English, but many of the countries where it's actually taking place now are not English speaking. And also because we have this conference of law and practice, and so without going into too much detail on that around this, because I don't think there are too many lawyers in the room, but we do need to recognize that there are major differences between, we have two major legal sort of systems of families in the world. We have the common law system and the civil law system. And the common law system, which is basically in the Anglo-Saxon world, is fundamentally different in terms of the way the legal system, sort of the judicial system, enforcement, and a lot of terminology, and a lot of the terminology in the business and human rights field. And this is arguably actually a problem that goes all the way back to the creation of the UN framework and the UN guiding principles, that there are some of these terminologies that have never been set straight. And I think there is a major thing that could also be an opportunity for this group. Now also with this EU legislation that's rolling out and applying around the rest of the world, to really try to set this straight and to involve people. I mean, that one of the things I think we need to do is we need to walk our talk. When we talk about business and human rights, we talk about requiring or expecting companies to do due diligence. One of the really key aspects of that is meaningful stakeholder engagement. As some of you will know, that's also one of my pet fields of interest. But I think we need to do that too. We really need to be inclusive with the regions and the companies and the countries that are going to be affected by that, and really try to put ourselves in their shoes and then bring them into the conversation. So that's one major thing. The other thing is about working with students. And I think, students, I completely agree, they're excellent ambassadors. And somehow I think the way things are now, we don't even need to worry too much about bringing the deans into the picture if they don't want to talk to us, because to some extent, don't get me wrong, but they're a little bit of a lost cause in this. We've got the students, they're rolling this out. So let's just work with them. I just had a new course that has been that is really on the managerial implications of all these new EU regulations accepted, because there is student interest for it. And it's just like, I didn't even expect that. But if something is happening, let's just work with the students, let them do the job for us. The third thing, and that's around engaging with what's happening in businesses. And I absolutely recognize and agree with Ron Popper's view on working with the different business functions. I think in finance, human resources, contracts, all of those business departments are hugely important. I think the major challenge in there is to make sure that now, with all this focus on the EU laws, this doesn't just become another compliance exercise. And I think that's the major challenge, is to make sure that somehow the essence of human rights due diligence needs to be translated. It is about not doing harm. It's not about making a lot of reports and checking a lot of boxes, because then we're going to completely lose it. And right now, that's my main fear. So those were my comments. Thank you very much.
But I would love to call on her if that's possible. Vasanti, can you hear us?
Yes. Can you hear me, Doro? Okay.
Yes, works well.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for this wonderful convening, and miss being there. You must have wondered what happened for 4 years that I have been silent on the business and human rights from India. And I just wanted to bring three perspectives as I was listening to what was happening in the room. The first one, I think, in terms of teaching material today, there's no shortage in business schools, and there are several people who are actually talking about CSR, social impact, social entrepreneurship, and related areas. The interesting one is that ever since India's CSR Act, once it became a legislation, I think to bring back corporate responsibility as a discourse, which it is not tied to 2% and funding, has indeed been a tough task. So what are the three narratives, and where do we as business schools have the bandwidth or even the perspective to be able to manage it? First, maximum requests are coming from EU companies, asking from a compliance perspective, and that has been growing over the last year. The reality, however, is that less than 10% of total companies in India are large listed companies. 90% of the value chain, both supply end as well as the front, are all small and medium enterprises. So, as business schools, I think many of us have largely worked with large companies. And to actually be able to translate human rights in a way that makes sense to the SMEs and be able to kind of build material for that is something that one is just beginning to think about. The third dimension to this is also that contextualizing human rights in a non-Western lens, and not bringing in shame, guilt, or a backlash. I think those sensitivities and subtleties as we navigate, I think is quite a challenge as I speak to you. So all in all, I think the Indian discourse and the way we can bring it into the management schools at this point in time, a little muted, requires some bit of philosophical rethinking on how to be able to present the complexity of human rights in a classroom that makes what India has done so far relevant and meaningful, and yet push for stronger discussions. I think that's not an easy task as I speak. Thank you. I think it's just seeing so many of you here that I think keeps us going. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Real pleasure to be here. Thank you, Dorothy, for heading and leading this for the last number of years. And just want to say thanks to all my colleagues here who have contributed and also listened. I think I'm from Australia. I work with the industry and on boards of 2 universities, and I'm also advising the minister in terms of policy. So my perspective is not so much about creating cost development of programs, but more about how do we translate some of these ideas into a bigger picture, and then from a bigger picture to operationalizing it from a policy level, educational level, and also industry level. And so my observation in industry, particularly in Australia, when we look at the mining sector, and then of course translating and transferring these knowledge and training programs to our closest neighbor, which is Indonesia, that has also have a very thriving mining sector. The major challenge we have is how do we translate compliance to commitment? And very much like the previous speaker, Ron, you mentioned something about messaging and communication. So, you know, Western Australia make our business in business school through a lot of international students. In fact, I think it's the same as well, just in when it comes to Eastern states. So more than 60 or 70% of our revenue comes from Asia. So this language about cultural differences is really important with what was highlighted before. There are differences between rights and responsibility. So when it comes to the approach on communicating human rights education, in the Western society, it's a lot got to do with compliance. But the sense of working with the industry, the sense of responsibility, and making sure that you don't just talk about it from private sector or from a university or government, but actually from an ecosystem perspective is really important. So when you look at legislation, it's the same. So with AI at the moment in the West, it's all about compliance, reducing risk and so on. Whereas in the Asian approach, it's all about how can we make sure that this is not just a conversation that's going to be led by government and private sector, but also from an industry perspective. So what's the difference between private sector and industry perspective is that in industry, it includes, like what the lady was saying before, the 70-80% of small businesses, micro businesses, they're driving the economy. The bigger corporations, so the big tech companies have to help the small companies. The bigger universities have to help the regional universities to upskill and transfer these knowledges. So, you know, the number of ways of engaging with students as well, what we found out was students want to talk about these from a fun perspective. So how do we actually have hackathons to encourage them to think about in an innovative way? And we found that that kind of strategy actually help to bridge those cultural gaps. So if you talk about human rights education from a compliance perspective, a lot of companies are just avoiding it. And I was trying to link up some projects from World Economic Forum with the labor rights project in the mining sector in Indonesia. And there were just no takers, even though there were free workshops provided by the World Economic Forum. There were free training. So these Indonesian companies are really concerned because, number one, they don't want to be named and shamed. Yeah. Number two, if they were to send their students across, how are the students going to come back and rock the system or cause any kind of discord within the ecosystem? So the only way to engage them is by having these fun hackathons. And another way as well, we found out when we work with the Vietnamese leadership delegations, people from the federal government, is that we can have policy labs that where you include not just the private sector, the business school, but also the government sector in a fun way and in a less restrictive way. So those are just some of the experiences I can share, but particularly the cultural differences does influence on the way we communicate the human rights education. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Yeah. No. Very valuable perspectives from India and then Australia and Vietnam and Indonesia. Mike, you wanted to close the meeting. We are running out of time as every year, but we'll have a bit more time, as I said, after the meeting to sit together if you want to. But let's make sure the online audience gets a closing.
Yeah, really good discussion. I want to link a couple of things that people said in the last hour. Bjorn, you talked about, and we all are very aware of the European legislation, which is so important in framing the way forward. And we've heard now in the last 20, 15 minutes, several comments about how to integrate what European governments are demanding with what's happening on the ground. We heard from Dr. Saeed and Hani about how in Qatar, in the Gulf, there's an effort to figure out how to integrate this into the local setting. And I commend the ILO, Max, Marie-Jose, really helped make that happen. But I think that's a model for us to be thinking about. How do we take the concepts coming from Brussels and apply them in a local context, which feels very different? Charles, you talked also about the over-reliance on the English language, the fact that whole parts of the world are still not really part of the discussion. That's another piece. And Vasanthi, your comment in some ways sort of incorporates a lot of what we've been talking about. There is an expectation on global companies. A lot of us teach and work with global companies that are paying a lot of attention to the European legislation. There is a discussion that needs to go on about the relationship between global buyers and their suppliers. What are the expectations coming from European governments, European and Western publics that now gets translated to local suppliers who don't have the resources, the context to deal with what's coming at them. So I think that this is a place I would love to replicate with the ILO or with others, what we did, what Lucy and I did in Doha. I think there really is a rich potential for this network to be looking for where some examples of business schools in less developed states, global south, who are dealing with these things on a daily basis. And how do we make this discussion more real as European states are now figuring out what their laws are? How do we make sure that it really has the right impact? And there's the right division of responsibility between global companies, Western governments, and the people that are on the front line. So I think that's part of the themes I heard, and I think it offers some great possibilities for all of us to be thinking about creative ways in the next few years to integrate all of this and make sense of it so that we actually get some results on the ground.
I want to thank you all because we will be working with you on this. So we're stronger together, I think you said earlier, Catherine. So looking forward to working with you in the future, and thanks for joining today. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Doro, for making this happen. Thanks, everybody, for coming.